In 1307, the King of France ordered the arrest of thousands of Europe's most powerful people in a single day. They were not enemies of the state. They were bankers, diplomats, and heroes of the Crusades. It was the biggest financial scam of the Middle Ages. He was not a knight. He did not wear the white mantle with the blood-red cross. He was a creature of the periphery, a clerk of the treasury within the temple's formidable walls. To the world, the Templars were iron and faith. To Everard, they were numbers. He knew the weight of a soul not by its prayer, but by the interest it accrued on a loan to a desperate count. Time, in the Middle Ages, was not a linear progression but a circular trap. It was marked by the tolling of bells, matins, lauds, prime, each chime a reminder that the world was merely a waiting room for eternity. But for Everard, time was measured in the slow, agonizing evaporation of gold. As he dipped his quill into the gall ink, he felt the heavy presence of the temple around him. It was a fortress of shadows. The walls were thick enough to muffle the screams of the dying and the secrets of the living. The order was an empire within an empire, a state that owned the dead of kings. And therein lay the rot. Freedom, Everard often mused, is the most expensive luxury one can purchase. A peasant is bound to the land, a knight to his oath, and a king to his creditors. King Philip IV, the Iron King, was a man of cold marble features and an even colder treasury. He was a king who ruled a land of hunger while the Templars sat upon mountains of coin. Everard saw the friction before anyone else. He saw the way the king's eyes lingered on the temple's spires, not with devotion, but with the gaze of a man looking at a locked chest to which he has lost the key. The office where Everard worked was located near the lower vaults. The air there was perpetually stale, filtered through layers of limestone. It carried the faint, metallic scent of the heavy coins stored below, a smell that was both intoxicating and nauseating. It was the smell of power that had no pulse. On this particular evening, the wind howled through the arrow slits, sounding like the voices of those who had fallen in Acre, crying out for a purpose that had long since been traded for land and titles. Everard watched the flame of his single candle dance. He thought of the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, a man of archaic honor who moved through the world as if it were still the age of the Crusades. De Molay did not understand that the sword had been replaced by the contract. He did not realize that the ink Everard spilled on the page was more lethal than any Saracen blade. To sell a kingdom, Everard whispered to the empty room. One does not need an army. One only needs a doubt. Faith, in those days, was the skin of the world. To puncture it was to invite the abyss. But Everard's faith had been eroded by the sheer repetitive nature of greed. He had seen the letters of credit, the mortgages on soul lands, the price of absolution. If God was the ultimate creditor, then the Templars were his ruthless tax collectors. And if the collectors grew richer than the Lord, the hierarchy would inevitably collapse. The door to his chamber creaked open. It was not a sudden sound, but a slow, deliberate intrusion. A man stepped in, cloaked in the blue of the French court, his face half hidden by a hood that smelled of rain and expensive musk, the scent of the Louvre, the scent of the king's inner circle. This was Guillaume de Nogaret, the king's right hand, a man whose soul was a labyrinth of legalities and malice. He did not speak of God. He spoke of necessity. The king is troubled, Everard, Nogaret said, his voice like the grinding of dry stones. He wakes in the night feeling the weight of the temple pressing against his chest. It is a heavy thing, to owe so much to those who answer to no one but a distant pope. Everard did not look up from his ledger. The order is the pillar of the church, Messire. To strike at it is to strike at the foundations of heaven. Heaven is high, Nogaret replied, stepping closer until the scent of his musk overpowered the lavender. And Paris is very low. The foundations are already cracked. We only need someone to point out where the deepest fissures lie. Someone who knows the books. Someone who knows what is whispered in the dark during the secret initiations. At that moment, Everard felt the shift in the world's axis. He understood that he was no longer merely a clerk. He was the architect of a catastrophe. Death is often portrayed as a skeleton with a scythe, but for the Templars, death was coming in the form of a decree. Everard looked at the ink on his fingers. It was black, like the void that lies between the stars. He thought about the brothers he broke bread with, the knights who believed their courage was their shield, not realizing that their own ledger was their executioner. The silence between the two men deepened, filled only by the distant, rhythmic dripping of water somewhere in the bowels of the temple, a countdown that no prayer could halt. The weeks that followed the meeting with Nogaret were held in a fragile, suffocating suspense. Paris in early autumn was a city of grey mist and the smell of roasting chestnuts, but inside the temple, the air felt like it was thickening into lead. Everard moved through the cloisters like a ghost among the living. He watched the knights train in the courtyard, men of iron muscle and weathered skin, and felt a pang of distant pity. They practiced for a war that would never come, while the real war was being fought in the silence of his inkwell. Faith is a peculiar anchor. It holds firm as long as the sea is predictable, but when the tide turns into a whirlpool, the anchor becomes a weight that pulls the ship under. The Templars believed in their immunity. They were the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, protected by papal bulls and centuries of blood spilled in the Levant. They did not understand that the world had grown tired of its protectors. Everard spent his days cross-referencing names. He sought out the broken men within the order, those who had been disciplined for minor infractions, those whose minds had frayed under the weight of isolation, and those who harbored a secret resentment against the Grand Master's rigid austerity. He listened to their whispers during the meal times, noting the way some looked at the crucifix with more fear than love. One evening, he sat with a young initiate named Jean, whose hands trembled as he poured wine. The boy's eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering torches of the refectory. He spoke of the initiation rites, of the darkness of the chapel at midnight, and how the shadows seemed to take shapes that were not of this world. Everard did not correct him. He did not tell him that the shadows were merely the product of tired minds and flickering light. Instead, he leaned in and whispered, "The king hears that some are asked to deny the cross to prove their obedience. Is that not a heavy burden for a soul?" The boy's silence was all Everard needed. It was a silence born of confusion, but in the hands of a lawyer like Nogaret, it would be sculpted into a confession of heresy. Time began to feel like a predator. Everard noticed the small changes, the way the royal tax collectors hovered longer at the temple gates, the way the whispers in the markets of Paris had turned from reverence to suspicion. Rumors were being sown like seeds in a fertile field, stories of secret idols, of strange kisses during ceremonies, of wealth hidden in vaults that stretched to the center of the earth. These were the weapons of the new age, not steel, but the shared breath of a frightened populace. In his moments of solitude, Everard climbed to the top of the temple tower. From there, he could see the Seine winding through the city like a silver serpent. He thought about the nature of power. The Templars had power because people believed they were holy. The king had power because people believed he was necessary. But Everard had power because he knew that belief was a fragile, manufactured thing. Is a man truly free if his life depends on the stories others tell about him? He wondered, the wind whipping his thin hair. He realized that the knights below were prisoners of their own myth. They could not change, they could not adapt. They were statues of a bygone era, and statues are easily toppled when the pedestal is undermined. The scent of the city changed as winter approached, the dampness of the river became sharper, and the wood smoke from 1,000 hearths created a permanent shroud over the streets. On the night of October 12th, the atmosphere was unnaturally still. Everard stayed in the counting room, his fingers stained black with the final lists for Nogaret. He could hear the distant tolling of a bell, but it wasn't the call to prayer. It was the sound of a closing door. He looked at the crucifix on the wall, a simple wooden thing. He wondered if the God of the Templars was watching him. If there was a record kept in a ledger in heaven, what was the price of his soul? He felt no fear, only a hollow, cold curiosity. If death was the final auditor, he hoped his books would balance. As the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon of October 13th, a date that would be etched in the memory of the world, Everard heard the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves. It was not the sound of returning crusaders. It was the sound of the king's men, carrying scrolls signed in the name of the law. The kingdom was about to be reclaimed, and the merchant of echoes was finally ready to close the deal. The morning of Friday, October 13th, did not break with a celestial omen, but with the cold, rhythmic clanking of mail and the heavy scent of damp iron. As the sun struggled to pierce the thick mist hanging over the Seine, the great gate of the temple was not opened by a brother in prayer, but shattered by the king's authority. Everard watched from the high window of the archives, his breath fogging the cold glass. Below, the courtyard was a sea of blue surcoats, the king's men, moving with the mechanical precision of a clockwork trap. The arrest of the order was a masterpiece of logistics, a triumph of the ledger over the sword. Across France, at the same precise hour, thousands of knights, sergeants, and chaplains were being led away in chains. There was no grand battle, no glorious last stand. History, Everard realized, often ends not with a clash of steel, but with the soft rustle of a warrant being read aloud in a cold hallway. As he descended the spiral staircase, the sounds of the temple had changed. The chanting of psalms had been replaced by the shouting of soldiers and the heavy thud of wooden chests being hauled from the treasury. He passed Jacques de Molay in the main hall. The Grand Master stood with a bewildered dignity, his white mantle stained by the dust of the scuffle. De Molay looked at the soldiers not with anger, but with the confusion of a man who had forgotten that even giants can be tripped by shadows. "Where is the justice of the king?" De Molay's voice echoed, hollow and aged. Everard stepped past him, keeping his gaze fixed on the floor. He knew where the justice was. It was in the ink on his fingers, in the carefully curated lies he had fed to Nogaret, and in the king's empty vaults that were now destined to be filled. Justice, in the eyes of the state, was simply the name given to the most profitable outcome. The knights were led to the dungeons of the Petit Châtelet. The transition from masters of the world to prisoners of the crown happened in the space of a single heartbeat. In the darkness of the cells, the smell of incense was replaced by the stench of wet straw and fear. Everard was tasked with overseeing the inventory of the seized goods. He walked through the silent dormitories, touching the simple pallets where warriors had slept, and felt the immense, crushing weight of isolation. Isolation is the cruelest form of pressure. A man can face an army if his brothers are beside him, but when he is left alone in a stone box, with only the sound of his own pulse for company, his soul begins to fray. The Inquisition began its work soon after. They did not seek the truth, they sought a mirror for the king's accusations. Everard sat behind a screen during some of the interrogations. He heard the voices of the men he had known, men like Jean, the young initiate. The boy's voice was no longer a whisper, it was a fractured sob. The inquisitors spoke of the spitting on the cross, and the idol of Baphomet. These were phantoms, ghosts conjured from the darkness of the temple's own secrecy, yet under the pressure of the rack and the solitude of the cell, they became real. Time is a fire, Everard thought as he recorded the forced confessions. It consumes the reality of what was and leaves behind only the ash of what we want to believe. He saw that the Templars were being destroyed by the very thing that had made them great, their mystery. Because they had operated in the shadows of their own rituals, the world found it easy to believe that those shadows held demons. Freedom was being stripped away, not just from the men in chains, but from the truth itself. One night, Nogaret found Everard in the empty library. The shelves, once filled with the wisdom of centuries, were being cleared. "You look troubled, clerk," Nogaret said, his eyes gleaming in the torchlight. "The king is pleased. The debt is dissolving. The people cheer at the fall of the arrogant. The people cheer at any spectacle," Everard replied, his voice flat. "But what happens when the spectacle is over? When the king has spent the temple's gold, who will he blame for the next hunger?" Nogaret laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering on stone. "There will always be another shadow to hunt, Everard. That is the secret of ruling. You must provide the people with a monster so they do not notice the chains they wear themselves." Everard looked out at the darkened city. The temple towers stood like tombstones against the moon. He realized that by selling the kingdom's protectors, he had helped create a world where no one was safe. Faith was no longer an anchor, it was a weapon. And as he picked up his quill to begin the next ledger of names, he wondered if the beautiful, bitter conclusion of this story would ever be written in a language he could understand. Winter settled over Paris with a cruelty that seemed intentional, as if the heavens themselves were conspiring with the king to freeze the spirit of the order. The stone walls of the temple, once a symbol of sanctuary, had become a vast, cold tomb. Everard found himself increasingly isolated, trapped between the world of the living and the world of the condemned. He no longer walked the cloisters, he haunted them. Silence is a heavy garment. For the knights in the dungeons, it was a silence filled with the echoes of their own doubts. For Everard, it was the silence of a man who had won a war only to find the spoils were made of salt. The wealth he had meticulously catalogued for the king was vanishing, not into the coffers of the state, but into the endless greed of officials and the costs of a trial that seemed to have no end. Time, Everard observed, had lost its circular grace. It had become a jagged line, dragging the prisoners toward an inevitable, dark horizon. In the cold of December, he was summoned to the cells to witness the persuasion of an elderly knight, Sir Baudouin, a man who had spent 40 years defending the pilgrim paths in the East. Baudouin did not look like a heretic. He looked like an uprooted oak. His eyes, clouded by age and the darkness of the cell, sought out Everard's. "Tell me, clerk," the old man wheezed, his breath a white plume in the freezing air. "Does the king truly believe that God can be bought with a lie? Or does he think that by burning the temple, he can hide from the eyes of the Lord?" Everard felt a tremor in his hand as he held his parchment. "The king seeks the purity of the realm, Messire. He follows the law. The law of men is a shadow cast by their own hunger." Baudouin replied, his voice surprisingly steady. "But shadows vanish when the sun goes down. What will you do, little scribe, when the night comes for you?" The old knight's words stayed with Everard long after he left the dungeon. He began to realize that freedom was not just the ability to move through the streets, it was the ability to look at one's own reflection without flinching. He had traded his peace for a position of prominence, but the prominence felt like a shroud. The smell of the city in winter was a mixture of damp wool, wood ash, and the metallic tang of frozen mud. It was a suffocating scent that clung to his robes. He spent his nights in the library, reading the forgotten scrolls of the Order's early days. He read of their vows of poverty, of their total surrender to a cause greater than themselves. He felt a bitter envy for their certainty. Even in their ruin, the knights had a brotherhood that he, in his betrayal, could never know. One evening, a letter arrived from Rome. The Pope was wavering, trapped between his duty to the Church and the king's iron grip on his throne. The trial was becoming a labyrinth of politics, a game where souls were used as pawns. Everard saw that the truth had become entirely irrelevant. It didn't matter what the Templars had actually done, it only mattered what could be proven in the court of public opinion. He watched the people of Paris. They went about their lives, buying bread and mending shoes, while just a few streets away, the history of their world was being rewritten in blood. The indifference of the masses was perhaps the most terrifying part of the tragedy. They didn't care for justice, they cared for the price of grain. Is faith merely a comfort for those who are afraid of the dark? Everard mused, staring into the embers of his fire. Or is it a flame that requires a sacrifice to keep burning? He realized that he had become the sacrifice, though he was still breathing. He had sacrificed his humanity to be the hand that moved the quill. As the year turned and the first hints of a deceptive spring began to thaw the Seine, Everard understood that the beautiful, bitter conclusion of the temple's story was no longer a question of if, but how. The kingdom had been sold, the price had been paid, and now, all that remained was the delivery of the dead. Spring in Paris usually felt like a resurrection, a time when the river shook off its icy shackles and the cherry blossoms near the Notre Dame whispered of life's renewal. But in the spring of 1314, the air felt stagnant, heavy with the scent of old dust and the metallic tang of an approaching storm. The trial of the Templars had dragged on for 7 years, a long, agonizing descent through the circles of bureaucracy and despair. Everard, now a man whose hair had turned the color of the ash he so often studied, moved through the city like a remnant of a forgotten age. The wealth of the temple was gone, dissolved into the king's wars and the endless fees of the inquisitors. The kingdom had been saved from debt, but it was now bankrupt of spirit. Everard saw it in the faces of the people, a growing cynicism, a fear that if the mighty could be so easily broken, then no one was truly safe. He was summoned one final time to the presence of Guillaume de Nogaret. The councillor looked like a corpse kept animated by sheer spite. "It is time to finish the work, Everard," Nogaret whispered, his hands trembling as he shuffled the final decrees. "The Grand Master and his lieutenants have recanted their confessions. They claim they spoke only under the pressure of the rack. They dare to challenge the king's truth." Everard felt a strange, hollow relief. After 7 years of silence and lies, the truth was finally trying to break through the stone. "And what is the king's response to such courage?" "There is no room for courage in a state built on necessity," Nogaret replied. "They will be treated as relapsed heretics. The fire will have the final word." As the preparations for the execution began on the Alde, Everard stood on the banks of the Seine. He watched the workers pile the faggots of wood, the smell of fresh pine and damp earth filling the air, a cruel contrast to the purpose of the pyre. He thought about the nature of time. For 7 years, the knights had lived in the twilight of the dungeons, their world shrinking until it was only the size of a prayer. And now, their time was to be compressed into a single, scorching moment. He remembered the old knight, Sir Baudouin, who had died in his cell years before. He wondered if Baudouin's soul was watching from the heights, or if there was only the silence he had so often feared. If a man sells the kingdom, does he also sell his place in the afterlife? Everard felt no fear of hell, only an immense, crushing exhaustion. He was tired of being the witness to a world that had lost its moral compass. The day of the execution was overcast, the sky a bruised purple. A massive crowd gathered, drawn by the macabre spectacle of seeing the mighty reduced to smoke. Everard stayed at the periphery, hooded and silent. He saw Jacques de Molay being led to the stake. The Grand Master did not look like a broken man. He looked like a figure of ancient marble, cold and unyielding. As the flames began to lick at the wood, the smell of the city changed once more. It was a thick, cloying scent that stuck to the throat. Everard closed his eyes, but he could not shut out the voice of de Molay, which rose above the crackling of the fire. The Grand Master did not scream, he summoned. He called upon the king and the pope to meet him before the judgment seat of God within the year. It was a curse that sounded like a prophecy. Everard turned away before the end. He walked back toward the empty temple, the streets suddenly feeling too narrow, the air too thin. He realized that the beautiful, bitter conclusion he had been waiting for was not a resolution, but a beginning. The kingdom had been sold, the order destroyed, and the ledger closed, but the debt was now being moved to a much higher court. Freedom, he whispered to the darkening streets, is knowing that even the most powerful king cannot buy his way out of the grave. He felt the first drops of rain on his face, a cold, cleansing touch that felt like tears from a god who had finally decided to speak. The merchant of echoes had nothing left to sell, and for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to record. The year that followed the smoke of the Alde was a year of reckoning, as if the world itself were trying to balance the ledgers that Everard had so carefully manipulated. It began with the Pope, Clement V, whose health withered like a vine in the frost. He was gone by April. Then, in November, the Iron King, Philip IV, fell during a hunt, a man of marble finally shattered by a force he could not tax or imprison. The curse of Jacques de Molay had become the rhythm of the realm. Everard did not rejoice. He lived in a small room near the outskirts of Paris, a place where the air was thinner and the noise of the city felt like a distant tide. He had kept no gold for himself. He had discovered that the price of a kingdom is not something one can spend on bread. He spent his days watching the dust motes dance in the light of his window, each speck a tiny world spinning in a void. Time, he now understood, was the only true sovereign. It did not matter who wore the crown or who held the keys to the treasury. Time eventually claimed every debt. He thought of the Templars not as heroes or heretics, but as travelers who had reached their destination sooner than expected. They were free now, while he remained a prisoner of his own memory. The smell of his room was a simple one, old paper and the faint, sweet scent of a dying apple on the sill. It was a peaceful smell, stripped of the copper and musk of the palaces. Sometimes he would walk to the river and watch the water flow beneath the bridges. The Seine did not care for the blood that had been spilled or the gold that had been stolen. It simply flowed, a relentless movement toward an infinite sea. In his final reflections, Everard realized that the tragedy of the Order was not their destruction, but the realization that everything built by human hands is destined to be a ruins. Faith, power, and loyalty are merely the stories we tell ourselves to ward off the fear of the inevitable end. He had sold the kingdom because he believed in the permanence of the king's law, but he saw now that the law was as fleeting as the breath he drew. "We are all merchants of echoes," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "We trade our souls for sounds that fade before the sun sets." As winter approached once more, Everard felt the final audit approaching. He was not afraid. He had cleaned his quills and closed his books. There were no more names to record, no more secrets to sell. He felt a strange, beautiful lightness, as if he were finally being erased from the ledger of the world. The story of the man who sold a kingdom ended not with a grand gesture, but with a quiet sigh in a room filled with shadows. The kingdom remained, changed and scarred, but the merchant vanished into the mist of history, leaving behind only the echo of a bell that had long since stopped tolling. The bitter conclusion was finally beautiful because it was complete. The debt was settled, the silence was absolute, and at last, Everard was free.
Like and subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories.